Welcome to the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Come here weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network.
Hi, welcome to the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast. Today we're here with Joann Lublin, who was management news editor for the Wall Street Journal, working with reporters in the U.S. and abroad until she retired 3 years ago. She's still a regular journal contributor, speaks about issues such as leadership and executive women. She created the paper's career advice column in 1993 and kept writing your executive career column until May of 2020. She's got a great new book out. It is called Power Moms: How Executive Mothers Navigate Work and Life, which we are excited to talk about since I think all mothers this year are having special challenges navigating work and life. So, Joann, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, and my co-host there is Michelle Brigman, and Michelle and I were talking about how back in the days when I was still in daily journalism, there was a time I was on an investigative project and it went on for months and things pile up. And so I would take the piles of mail and everything else and I'd put it in the guest bedroom just to stick it away while I was focusing on my career and doing the best work I had ever done in my life. And one day, all of our friends came over because we were all going out to dinner together. And my husband, I guess passive aggressively, and I should say my ex-husband, opened that door and said, "Hey, everybody, look at this." And you saw this mess. And it suddenly didn't matter that I was doing the best work I had ever done. The most important, I had failed as a woman, as a housekeeper. It's like the things that we have to do at home are the things that define whether we succeed in general. And with women, everything.
Wait, stop.
Yeah.
What did you say? What did you say to your husband afterwards?
Probably I want a divorce. No, I'm kidding, because I loved him. I just told him that was a very passive aggressive thing to do. And he apologized because he was somewhat enlightened. But it really showed how we can feel this big if you're managing everything right and you fail at the things you're supposed to get right most. And I think that's the root of mom guilt and so much of what people go through because women still are doing everything. So that leads me to you when I want to say, all these years later, why is that so that women are still responsible for doing everything right? And that especially means motherhood.
I think it's because we impose that expectation on ourselves as we have incorporated our society's norms that have been very slow to change. And frankly, men and women are guilty of having gendered expectations of each other's roles. I've been on several conversations and events recently where men have said, who are the interviewers or in your place, saying, I never felt working father guilt. Am I a bad dad that I didn't feel working father guilt? Well, no, because dads aren't expected to feel guilty if they're not the perfect father. But we live in an economy and a society where somehow women have to be held to a different standard when it comes to parenting. Men and women should be held to an equal standard. And the way you change that, it seems to me, is you recognize the elephant in the room. And you deal with that elephant in the room by, for instance, having mandatory unconscious bias training. And this is something that employers ought to be doing, not just once and not just for the people who are the first line supervisors or the hourly workers. This should be something that the CEO has to go through every year. I wrote about unconscious bias training for the Wall Street Journal some years ago, and I actually went to one of those sessions. And I thought it would be simple to figure out, where my unconscious biases lay. I figured they would show us a picture of a tall black guy and say, what do you think he is? And everyone would say, a basketball player, whatever. But it was much more subtle than that. We were given a whole bunch of resumes and pretended to be hiring managers. And we had to stack them in what order we would interview or consider the candidate. And lo and behold, to the extent that this was true, if one of those resumes had come from someone who went to my alma mater, that ended up on the top of the stack. That's unconscious bias. We tend to gravitate towards what we know and people who look like us or behave like us. And we tend to embrace sort of how we think women and men should act when it comes to parenting. The other thing that I discovered in reporting my first book, Earning It, was that you can publicly shame people into changing their behavior. That's why I asked you what you said to your husband and whether you did it in front of the friends who were visiting or you waited later to chew him out. One of the things I wrote about in the last chapter in Earning It was about men who were going the extra mile to advance women. And in one case, there was a guy who was an attorney who represented high-tech companies, VC firms, who decided he no longer was going to serve on panels at tech conferences unless there was at least one woman on the panel. And when there are no women on panels, then we have different expectations for what women can or can't do. And so there came to be a term called manels. And a manel is a panel that has no women. Wait, it gets even better than that. I found a Finnish art professor who had started a website where everyone in the world could send photos of the worst manels they had ever seen.
Oh my gosh.
And the one that I mentioned in Earning It was a EU conference on the advancement of the status of women. And there's this big banner right in front of the dais where all the panelists are seated, and it's all white guys.
So, but bringing it back to the moms thing, isn't the unconscious bias actually a conscious bias we have against ourselves in what we're doing?
I think it's both conscious and unconscious. I mean, I think we all at some point recognize that we're behaving certain ways because we think that's what is the right thing to do. What we don't recognize is what we define as the quote right thing to do is a cultural norm. And for instance, one of my longtime acquaintances is an executive recruiter who was born in Europe. And when she read the book, she was like, I was just blown away that women somehow identify whether they are adequate mothers as to whether they do the wash or he does the wash. She says, that's so not the criterion for determining, how good you are as a mother. That is something that ought to be your determination, not society's. But it is hard to withstand social pressures. I faced the same social pressure when I became pregnant for the first time. I had been a journalist for years. I loved being a journalist, just like I'm sure you did. My mother had been a teacher for years. And when I announced my pregnancy, my mom said, well, of course, now you're going to go into teaching. I was like, really? Why? I don't like teaching. I tried that. I created my own little summer day camp with a bunch of 4-year-olds. I had a headache every day at 12 o'clock when my son took them home. And she's like, well, that's the only way you're going to have your summers off that you can spend with your baby. And I said, Mom, I know that worked really well for you. And, I think it would be great to have the summers off, but it's not going to be any fun if I don't like what I'm doing the rest of the year. So I'm going to stick to journalism. When I was finished writing this book, but had not yet turned in the manuscript, I visited my mom for the last time a year ago, February, at her assisted living facility in Atlanta. And I said, Mom, I've dedicated this book to you. She said, oh, really? What is the dedication going to say? And I said, it's going to say, to my mother, Betty Lublin, she was always my biggest supporter of my role as a working mom. She said, no, that's not right. That's not right. I was critical of a lot of what you did. And she mentioned the thing about the fact I refused to become a teacher. I refused to conform to society's expectations that I would put my need as a parent ahead of my need to be a journalist, where instead I wanted to have it both. And I said, all right, Mom, I'll change it to say, my mother was always my biggest supporter and my biggest critic. She said, nope, that doesn't work either. You got to put the critic part first. If you will open your cover of Power Moms and read the dedication, you will see that the revised wording that my late mother, who died last April, dictated is what's in there. And so that's part of the social pressures. We get it from our prior generations as to what is acceptable behavior as a woman. But it has changed remarkably between the boomer generation and the new executive moms who were the women in the Gen Xer and the millennial workforce that I was interviewing. And to the point you were making about stashing all your mail in your guest room, I thought the greatest example of that was Beth Comstock, who goes on to become the vice chair of General Electric. And early on in her first unsuccessful marriage is working at a cable TV station on a weekday evening shift. So she gets a dinner break. She doesn't go off and have a nice little dinner. She rushes home to make dinner for her husband, who I think was a stockbroker. I was like, why couldn't he make dinner himself? And she said, well, she was a relatively newlywed. That's what I thought wives were supposed to do. So if you don't question the status quo, if you don't send in your favorite picture of a mantle, if you don't ask for unconscious bias training, then you are going to incorporate and perpetuate this kind of.
Joann, I mean, you raised such great points in terms of the woman, right? It's our responsibility to lean in from a place of power and recognize this isn't okay. And I know at one point in my life, my son was in elementary school. Now I hit right at the end of the baby boomer, so I was an early Gen Xer. I also had a sister who was, she graduated in the 70s with a computer sciences degree, traveled all over the world. And I remember I respected her, but I was also quite judgmental of how much she missed for those years. But I was traveling a lot with my job, and there was the class party. It was like a Valentine's party at the school. And I rushed to make sure that I was representing, right? Because what's a good mom? I'm doing it all. And I baked all these cookies. I stayed up late. I put the icing on them, individually packed, and I sent them off to school. Now, of course, I wasn't the one dropping them off. Well, because I was gone on a business trip. So I'd made them in advance. And I had called him for my trip and I said, hey, did you get the cookies? And he's like, what cookies? And I said, did you get the cookies for the Valentine's party? And he goes, no. And I mean, he's probably 6. And he said, why'd you make cookies, Mom? And I said, well, I thought you might like that I sent cookies because I couldn't be there. And he goes, I hate when the parents are at the parties because they're distracting and we can't play. And I went, so you don't care that I didn't make the cookies? And he goes, no, I don't want you to come to the parties. And I thought, okay, wait a second. I wasn't even doing this for him. I was doing this to right for me and to make sure that all the PTA moms in the room and were not thinking what a loser she is. She's a bad mom. And it was brilliant because at that point, I started having a different conversation with him. I'd ask, hey, there's this thing coming up. What do you care about? Do you want me there? I don't care if you're there. And he would tell me what was important for me to show up. And by God, I was going to show up. But had that little boy not said the wisest words to me, I would have killed myself and beat myself up to try to live up to that standard. So I think, how do women find that inner strength to
you just illustrated it beautifully, Michelle. And I have an entire chapter of 10 hacks for ditching working mother guilt. And those ideas and the concept for the chapter came from one of the boomer moms. And she was the boomer mom whose quote is around the one chapter in Earning It around working motherhood. And that quote was, manager moms are not acrobats. And so she said, you should have a chapter on ditching working mother guilt. And her best recommendation was, rather than once again beat yourself over the head over the fact that your family is not sitting down to dinner till 7 o'clock because you had that deadline to meet at 6, celebrate the fact that, gosh, we're sitting down to dinner at 7 o'clock together. Isn't this great? And so one of her hacks that she suggested that's in the book is this notion of get your kids involved with decisions and things you have to do for work where their input counts, where you can say, I have to take X number of trips this year, but I can decide exactly which day I'm going to be out of town, or I can decide which conference I'm going to go to. Let's get your school calendar in September for the whole school year, and let's pick out 3 or 4 special things that your class or your school is going to be doing that will involve you, where you want me to be there, okay? And I will design my work calendar around your school calendar, so the kid feels like they actually have a voice, and then you're not making cookies that get appreciated. There's a great story that I didn't include in the book, in which this boomer mom has to go out of town for an offsite meeting with her team. And so she's not home on her daughter's 11th or 12th birthday. I can't remember. I think it was 12th. And so she insists that everybody on her team join her on a conference call when they call the daughter up and sing her happy birthday. Now, that daughter was one of the 25 adult daughters I interviewed of boomer moms to find out what was it like growing up with a powerful executive as a mother. And so I asked this daughter, do you remember how you celebrated your 12th birthday? She said, oh, yes, I remember very vividly. I said, how did you celebrate? She said, well, we had the party as we always do on Saturdays, because most working moms have birthday celebrations for their kids, not on the weekday it occurs, but on the weekend. And mom made the special cake that she always did. I said, really? Oh, but she was out of town on the real birthday, which was the middle of the week. The daughter says, really? I don't remember that. She had no recollection of the call. Mom was there when it mattered. And mom made sure that that's what mattered to the daughter. I'm sure she asked the daughter, do you want me to again, are you tired of my making the special cakes or whatever? I didn't ask the mother that. But to my point earlier, involve your kids in your decisions that affect them and affect your job.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be, it's difficult.
I'm curious about more of those mom guilt hacks, because that's the one thing that, even if I've been speaking in China or whatever, that comes up all the time, and they feel that.
Yeah.
And not only do they have to be there for their kids, but they have to make sure they have the perfect Christmas dinner, the perfect Thanksgiving. It's because they don't want to fail in the big realm. So what are these hacks?
Well, one of them is one I just talked about. Another one is the idea of, if you have paid vacation, which most of us have some, if we're not self-employed, you organize to take a couple of vacation days several times a year as special days with each of your children. And there was this, again, great example in the book of this Accenture executive, Mary Hamilton, who arranged what she called mama days. And she did them once a quarter with each one of her 3 sons. They were pretty little when she started doing this, but the kid got to have a voice in where they spent the mama day. She spent a fair amount of time, at the playground with the younger kids, but at children's museum with the older one. But the point was that, again, this was showing that she was there for them and that they had something to look forward to. I think it's equally important to take care of yourself and to make sure that you have time for self-care. And again, another younger executive mom, negotiated with her husband that every Sunday there was 2 hours where she could do whatever she wanted. And it was a great bonding opportunity for dad and their one child, their toddler. And so she would go, this again was pre-pandemic, but she would go have brunch with her girlfriends. She would get a facial. She would, take a 2-hour bath if she wanted to. And so this notion that self-care is somehow selfish is totally a myth. Self-care is not selfish. Self-care is selfless, because if we aren't caring for ourselves, we can't be good people to the people we work with and the people who we care about the most, that is our families.
I'd love to dig into that one a little bit. I know that especially a lot of the moms who are, they've started out, they've set expectations of, I'm going to do all of the things, I'm going to take on all this responsibility. And I know that was certainly me, because that's what I thought I was supposed to do for many years. And I got to a point where, I'm having a nervous breakdown in the kitchen over putting someone's dish in the dishwasher because I'm sick of it, right? So I kind of lose my mind, which they're not used to. And everybody's panicked about, okay, what can I do? But it never sticks. So how did you find some of the hacks from the moms where they actually were able to sustain, changing roles and responsibilities across the home, because nobody wants to sign up to do more work?
Of course not. And the whole idea is that the expectations as well as the needs are going to change. They're going to be different when you're first married and you haven't even thought about whether you want to have kids. They're going to be different, obviously, when you've got a newborn underfoot. They're going to be different when that child or children are school age. And the whole idea is, first of all, you choose your life partner, you choose the spouse with care. And you talk about these issues before you make a long-term commitment, before you get married. In the case of my husband and I, we actually wrote out a marriage contract. And then what I found was very, very interesting in the example of one of the younger executive mothers is you revisit everything on a regular basis. And they did it from a very, very business-like approach. They had quarterly strategic planning meetings where they sat side by side at the kitchen table and they reviewed, how are things going in our marriage? How are things going in terms of sharing the domestic load? And once they became parents, how are things going in terms of who likes doing what and who hates doing what? Because frankly, maybe at the outset of your relationship, you really like doing laundry and he really likes cleaning, or you really like cooking and he really likes doing laundry. But then it turns out after 5 or 10 years, if you see another bottle of Tide, you may puke. And then it's time to revisit it. So maybe quarterly, planning meetings aren't necessary. Though in the case of this couple, when they were expecting their first child, they had a quarterly strategic planning meeting where the entire agenda was what kind of childcare arrangements should they have. She was already traveling very extensively for her job because she had become a vice president in her early 30s. And he had a very, very busy surgical practice. He had joined his father's medical practice. And so they came to the conclusion that they did need to have a nanny and they needed to have a live-in nanny, but they worked it out. And the issue here is nothing is set in stone and things change, and you have to stand up and push back and renegotiate terms that are acceptable, not just to you, but to your partner. And the men, frankly, if you are, your partner is a man, if they love you, they will want to figure out a way to make it work, but it's also got to work for them. There was another great example, as you remember in the book, where, this younger executive mother, she was a top legal executive, and her husband, again, had a pretty demanding job. She just was tired of being the third shift person. And that's the person who has the mental load, who figures out, when are we going to have somebody going to be here for the plumber? Who's going to take the kids to the doctor? Who's going to make sure that the forms get filled out for the vaccination? And she said, we're supposedly equal parenting, but we're not. And he's like, I get it. From now on, I will make the pediatrician's appointments. I will take the kids for their regular checkups. And what's the doctor's name again?
I remember that.
But there's a clash, I think, between what executive moms experience and non-executive, mid-level, or non-professional, and then all single parent moms, because they all have such extremely different experiences. And then right now, it's even more so because executive moms have resources. They can hire out, they can delegate more. But a lot of these other ones don't. And with COVID putting so much more pressure on them being at home and doing everything, it's even worse. So what's your take on all of this?
I think that is absolutely the case. But I also think that, we have to also resist our cultural norm of individualism. We cannot solve all of our problems individually. We have to look for broader solutions. And that can happen on the micro level, if that means creating a learning pod or a childcare pod where you cannot, the childcare center is not open or you cannot afford a childcare facility. You find someone else who is in similar circumstances where you can swap off who's the childcare provider for your respective children. My son and daughter-in-law did this in terms of a learning pod when school reopened last September. They were both trying to work full-time from home with 3 kids, 9 years old and under, 2 of whom were school age. And they, banded together with another family who had 2 school-age kids similar in age to theirs. And they hired a college student to essentially supervise the learning from home. And they alternated weeks as to whose house was the, quote, classroom. And by the same token, at the corporate level, companies have to be more sensitive to the fact that their employees' needs from a family need standpoint are going to vary all over the map. For one thing, there are plenty of people in the workforce who never have had children, or whose children are grown, or who never plan to have children, and they have personal needs as well. And so to accommodate continued work from home arrangements, which seems to be the way is going to be in the future. A survey just got released this morning showing that many, many employees would prefer to do that. There have been other surveys showing many employers plan to do that. Then employers have to be willing to do a couple things. They have to measure people's results, not their hours. They have to let people create protected hours and not dictate, okay, so you don't have to be reachable between noon and 1 every day. No. Okay, let people decide when the work is going to be done. And also, if you trust them to do the work whenever, then you also will trust them to set aside those protected hours. And at the more hugely national level, we need federal changes. We need more than what is just coming out of Congress now in terms of childcare subsidies. We need a mandated federal family medical leave that's now happening in a sort of scattered basis on individual states. We have unpaid mandated family and medical leave. That's not enough. Sorry to give you such a long-winded answer, but I feel pretty passionate about the fact that women at all levels need to have their needs addressed, but so do men, particularly when it comes to parenting.
But so what do you say to them today? Like those are good changes that we can aspire to, but they take time and they take awakening. But to moms who are struggling today, who don't have resources, what do you say about finding their sanity?
Well, one thing I would say about finding their sanity, if they're working for a big company, they should find out if there is an employee resource group that is aimed at parents or women of color, if they happen to be women of color, and look to other colleagues for some answers and for some resources and for who to go to for additional help within their workplace. Again, we shouldn't have to be fighting these battles alone. There are too many others of us who've already been there and done that, who can act as guides. And it's one of the reasons I signed up to become an expert on a great website called Fairy God Boss, which is a career website for working women, whether they have kids or not, who are struggling with some of these same issues. I just posted a reply 5 minutes before your taping occurred today, because these are aimed at working women who are struggling with all kinds of issues, not just relating to parenting. And I'm happy to give back because I know how hard it was for me. When I became pregnant for the first time, there were a half a dozen female reporters at the Journal who within a 2-week period announced their pregnancy. And the managing editor, I heard, was tearing his hair out. He was like, this is not in my job description. I don't think any female reporter had ever announced her pregnancy because there frankly weren't that many of us. And among those half a dozen reporters who had babies that year, I was one of 2 who came back to work and the other one quit a couple months later. So then as far as I knew, I was the only working mom among the Journal reporters. Maybe there were others. I certainly wasn't aware of it. And it was an extremely stressful and lonely existence. And it really hit home after the editorial page asked me and one of those 6 women who had quit to each write first-person essays that ran on the op-ed page and appeared when my son was 7 months old to explain our decision. She wrote about why she quit. I wrote about why I came back. And I got hugely negative reactions.
I notice in the obligation right of these companies, you see so many that are I was sharing with Fawn, you see so many that are like, well, we have benefits, we have leave, we have mother's rooms, we have all of these things, but a lot of the companies are really struggling to execute it well. I know in my own experience, coming back again after my second child, and again, this was like in 2007 and 2008, the mother's room is there. So I'm excited. That's something new that hadn't been there in advance. And I was traveling in to I was traveling in for business meetings, and I needed time to, go and pump. Well, the doors are all locked. Nobody could find a key. So, and I didn't have enough breaks within the meetings, right, to be able to go out and do what I needed to do, which of course drove additional stress. It ended up after 3 days. Well, I end up, not by choice, I dry up, and I'm ticked off at my company because while it looked good on paper, it just, like I said, wasn't executed well. And while I spoke up, it was, oh, well, we'll fix that next time. And so I think that I'm trying to figure out as well, these moms who are afraid to announce they're pregnant. I mean, this is still happening today. I'm afraid to announce I'm pregnant. I'm afraid that I'm going to be passed over for that next promotion. I don't see anybody else mentioning it, or if I do, they're not progressing. I don't want to be the trailblazer. So how do we do more to give them a voice to help drive change, as well as put more ownership on the companies to find out what the people really, really need? Not, oh, I'm going to do that because my competitors are doing it.
Well, the way the companies get told what needs to be done is by encouraging companies to regularly do employee surveys and snap polls, as well as encourage individual managers to be doing check-ins with their employees to see what it is not being met in terms of their needs. And, to the point you were making about being afraid to announce your pregnancy or to raise your hand for a promotion when you're pregnant, when I was doing the interviews for the book, I was like so surprised to hear so many of the younger executive women had actually done that, had not only gotten promoted while they were pregnant, in some cases gotten new jobs while they're pregnant. I wrote a whole career column about that. And what I found was that it worked for the most part, where there were women who were their bosses, or there were women who had had kids and who understood that it is possible to get a promotion while pregnant, go on leave, and come back. But at the same time, to the point I was making earlier, you cannot change an entire ecosystem, an entire company single-handedly. And so there's this great example, again, in the book, to the point you were making, where the management consultant comes back from maternity leave. She has to travel for work, and she also has to pump. But that means she has to take an extra suitcase along to carry all those bottles that of pumped, breast milk, running through the airport, hoping against hope that the suitcase doesn't pop open and her 3 days supply goes wherever. She gets back from that trip and is complaining about this to one of her clients, which is a law firm, and it's a guy. And he's like, well, we ship home the breast milk for our attorneys who are traveling and our nursing mothers. And she says, really? You mean the company pays for it? He says, yeah, there's services that do this. And so rather than this woman saying, hey, could you do that for me on my next trip? No, she knows there's a parenting employee resource group at this company. She knows that the executive sponsor is an older baby boomer mom who herself had come back after her kids were born. And so she asks the executive sponsor to be her advocate on behalf of all the parents in this ERG, who at this point, I think it's called a mother's ERG as opposed to parent, but it changes. And so they institute a pilot test of this, which is, again, what the executive sponsor recommends. We can't roll this out nationwide immediately. The guys will all go, what the heck are we doing here? And it works on a pilot level. Then they roll it out on a nationwide level. And then this company, which happens to be called Alex Partners, the global management consultancy, extends the benefit to the wives of the male management consultants who work at other companies, because they know that at that point, and this is again several years ago, shipping breast milk is not a standard benefit. But the point here is you shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel every time something happens to you that other women have dealt with. And the response should not be unique to you. It should be something that benefits everyone.
Yeah. Well, I know we are running toward the end of the podcast, and there's just a couple of things that really stood out as you were sharing the story. And again, I got so many great nuggets from the book. So I highly encourage our listeners to get Power Moms, especially, if you are in the midst of this scenario, right, where you're trying to juggle it all. But also, I think this is something that there's a call to action for those who are not in the middle of this and they're making decisions on behalf of companies, because you will have a greater understanding of the pain points and the needs of this audience, and it needs to open up some different conversations. And I think when I think about kind of the hard-won wisdom here that you shared, my biggest takeaway is find your voice. You've got to start communicating, whether it's with your spouse and your partner to figure out what are the rules that we're going to operate our home by, whether it's your children in terms of what's important and how do we build plans around that, or it's your peer group or your company. But if we aren't doing a better job of speaking up and asking for what we need, then the wrong decisions are going to be made in terms of what good looks like. So I really encourage folks to pick this up. I also would love to know what else can people do and that want to dig into this topic more. Where would you point them? And then if they want to connect with you, Joann, what's the best way to do that?
Well, to the point you just made, I want to sum it up very succinctly by urging women to consider this. If you don't ask, you don't get. And that was a major theme in the chapter in my first book about getting paid fairly. And I just a couple of days ago heard from a woman who read that first book and applied that to her next negotiations over a salary increase. And she got an 80% raise. And now she wants me to come talk to her current employer about Power Moms. And so, there is power in taking control of the situation and recognizing that we do have power and we just need to flex our muscles when appropriate. In terms of other resources,
80% raise. That's what we want to know.
Well, I haven't talked to the woman. It was just an email last Friday, so I can't tell. But in terms of other resources, there are all kinds of great organizations out there that are advocating on behalf of women. Fairy God Boss, I mentioned. There's NEW, which is the network of executive women. There are all kinds of blogs out there by women who are executive coaches who are advocating on behalf of women. In terms of Power Moms, if anyone would like to get a personalized autographed book plate, all you need to do is shoot me a snail mail telling me you ordered the hardback version and give me a mailing address to Joann Lublin at gmail.com.
Excellent. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. And just thank you for giving us the gift of your time and the knowledge that you gained by talking to all of these women as well as your own experience. Thank you so much for sharing your hard-won wisdom with us today.
Thanks, Joann.
You're welcome. You're welcome, both of you.
Thank you for joining the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Join us weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network. Visit hardwonwisdom.com for more on this podcast and for links to Fawn and Michelle's web pages and social media. Also, be sure to rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort, and we'll see you next week.